I am Yulin Hswen, Associate Editor of JAMA and JAMA Plus AI, and you're listening to JAMA Plus AI Conversations. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Yulin Liu, a Senior Staff Research Scientist in Google Research. In this role, he focuses on developing and validating machine learning for medical applications. Welcome.
Thanks, Yulin. Great to be on.
So tell me about this really cool study that was in JAMA Dermatology. And I love this experimental design. And you use the term Wizard of Oz setup. So tell me about this really beautiful design that you did.
So maybe I can take a small step back a little bit and kind of like describe where the studies fits into kind of like the broader picture first. What's happening is that we, over time, have experimented with different kinds of AI. There's kind of like very narrow kind of AI. It takes images input, and there is a categorical output, yes or no, that sort of thing. Nowadays, we're seeing a lot of AI that's more in a generative AI space, where you can input complex things like text and images and can output complex things like text and images. This is something slightly in between, maybe a bit closer to the narrow AI, where there's image inputs, but there's also structured data that's going in terms of the medical history and other things. So that's one axis in terms of complexity of the AI. The other axis we can think about is the realism of the evaluation that's being done. And at one level, I think, the easiest evaluation that one often does is that it's completely in silico, meaning that there's some output of the model that's being done on a data set, and you get experts to go look at the outputs and rate for how good these outputs are. So that's probably, a level that's completely in silico. And then all the way at the very end, there's maybe a level that you can consider kind of like full-on prospective studies where there's real people, real concerns using AI in some way. Again, this is somewhere in between. So what we've developed is essentially a dermatology AI tool that helps to interpret images and the structured medical history. And its goal is to present information that helps users understand potential matching conditions and then dive in a little bit deeply into each of these conditions. And the way we structured this was that it was a study with real people that were using this tool, but it wasn't their actual conditions. It was a retrospective set of conditions. So kind of like in between on both of these two axes. So the way we structured this was that this was a 3-armed study. It's interesting in that it's 3 arms because usually things are kind of like an A/B test, 2-arm based setup. So the first 2 arms are what you would expect. There's one negative control arm where people are provided access to the retrospective images, and they're told to imagine that they had it and try to understand and search for information any way they would usually do so online, and then come back and tell us if they are comfortable guessing what it could be and what they might do about it. So that's the negative control arm. The second arm is the more usual intervention arm. We had the dermatology AI provided to these participants. They looked at the case, and then they had the AI outputs shown to them, and they could navigate around any AI outputs as well as do additional searches if they so wished. And then similarly, they provided guesses on the same things. The third arm is the one Yulin just mentioned in terms of Wizard of Oz. I think that's the one that's quite interesting as a design, and I think one way to interpret it is that it's a positive control. So this is the arm where we essentially pretend that the dermatology AI tool is perfectly accurate. And the way we get to perfect accuracy in this case is that we had these ground truth differential diagnoses that were obtained from a panel of dermatologists per individual case. And from that ground truth, we basically said, let's pretend the AI outputted exactly this ground truth in that particular order. Therefore, what was happening was the participants were seeing the AI output. They did not know this, but the AI outputs were actually from the ground truth, essentially. And so this was a perfect AI. What's interesting is that this allows us to study what would happen when you have essentially a perfectly accurate AI compared to an AI with its actual accuracy on this particular dataset.
And so I find that fascinating. There's a lot of layers here. So one is this kind of idea in terms of your methodology that we're kind of looking at more of this organic kind of human behavior, right? Kind of like searching online and trying to get the interpretation. So what's the importance of that? And what was your thought process in designing in this type of matter versus what you were saying, just getting that type of categorical output?
Yeah, I think in a nutshell, it's about the human factors. And so whenever we're designing AI tools, I think one of the key questions is who are we designing for? And for some of our work, the target users who might be using it in future would be clinicians. And so when we think about a target user, how we present information, it's all geared towards a clinician audience. In this case, we wanted to design something that regular lay people could use. Now, part of the motivation there is that we know most skin conditions are very, very common. And a lot of people are looking for information generally about health and wellness and everything else online. And we expect that people are trying to figure out ways to figure out, I have a skin condition, it's a lesion or a rash or something, and they can see it. And they're trying to find out information about it. but they're not equipped with the expert terminology that a trained clinician would have. They're not able to describe the nature of the morphology, for example, the color that they use, much less clinical language, and so forth. So there are a variety of different factors that they can't describe in words alone. We knew people would be trying to use image-based tools if one existed. In this case, what we tried to do was then to develop this consumer-facing AI tool as a proof of concept and to see if it can then surface relevant conditions for these users.
I think it's really fascinating. I love this idea of trying to see how people source information, how people gather information and interpret it. So tell me what your findings were for this.
It's really interesting. There were 800 participants per arm of the 3 arms we discussed earlier. So what we basically found was that in both of these interventional arms, so both the regular intervention as well as the perfectly accurate Wizard of our AI arm, we found that they were much more comfortable by absolute about 20% guessing at what the condition could be. So that was a pretty large kind of like jump. Now, when you incorporate after the guess how accurate these guesses were, there was also quite a bit of a rise in terms of the guessing accuracy. So that was good. The part that was a little bit surprising, we didn't quite expect this, is that we saw that when we asked them what they thought the right next step for that particular case should be, and as a recap, this was not their actual condition, so they were trying to guess at if they had the condition, what the right next step could be. We found that for the regular interventional arm, the rate of guessing a correct next step didn't change very much. However, for the Wizard of Oz arm, where the AI was perfectly accurate, there was a significant increase in the next step accuracy. It was not very large, but it did exist. So one of the takeaways you can draw from this is that the accuracy of the AI actually does matter. However, in both of these cases, both the regular intervention as well as the positive control with perfect accuracy, we did see that there was still quite a bit of a gap remaining in terms of both accuracy and next steps. And so that part of the takeaway is that it's got to be something that's not related to the AI accuracy at that point, because AI was by definition perfectly accurate. And so it's very likely there is something in the way that we either present the information to people or the way that they interpret the information. So there's 2 sides of that coin. Something in that area has to be affecting the overall outcome. And so it's not quite sufficient to just design for better accuracy, although you want to do that. You have to also design for the user in mind and understand how they use it and how do you improve their ability to then take in that information.
Can you first tell me how did you evaluate what their intent was or what they were going to do next? And then from your perspective, what do you think that missing piece is?
Yeah, so the way we evaluated the next steps part of the decision making was that we had a 4-category question. It ranges from things like I would see a doctor today, like try to get an appointment somewhere today, to I'll just kind of like wait and monitor to see if it's getting worse or better, that sort of thing. So it's a 4-option problem. And so for each of these cases, we actually had dermatologists that label each individual case with what they thought the best next step should be. And so that forms the ground truth for the next step portion of things. And so we're evaluating if these participants were providing the same next step as what the dermatologists were recommending. So that was kind of like the evaluation. In terms of where the gap is, I think it's a little bit hard to say. I would say that there is the level that we're measuring, which is what they report for a condition that they didn't actually have, what they thought the next step should be, and there was a gap there. There's something we didn't measure, which was what if they actually did have that condition, what would they actually have done? And we do know that there's a little bit of a gap between what people report maybe they should do versus what they actually do. But that's a little bit of a separate topic. In terms of what we've managed to study, I think part of it was around how participants were actually using the AI tool. And the way they used it was they looked at the picture of the condition that they were imagining they had. And they looked at the what we call textbook images of that particular example that was in the AI prediction. So for each of the predictions they created, it had a little bit of a panel showing what are classic presentations of that particular condition. And what they were trying to do, and we found this actually via other studies, was that they were trying to do this kind of like pattern matching between these two. And so they saw a list of these predictions. For each condition, they had in the prediction list a number of like classic presentations. So they're trying to do pattern matching themselves for like, okay, this is the thing that I'm supposed to have in my imagination. What does it match best in this list of images? And so I think there's a little bit of an imperfection in that matching process, partially because the way the tool was designed back then was that for each condition, there's only a static set of these textbook conditions. So those conditions and images were not selected to be similar to the original presentation. So you would imagine that there are things that are different, such as which body parts on, what it looks like, maybe potentially the lighting, the morphology, and maybe even the severity could be quite different. And so I think that's part of it where if the users were not able to kind of like do that pattern matching properly, then they would probably be kind of like going past that prediction, saying, oh, this doesn't quite look like this, and we look at the next one. And in some ways, this is very similar to how people are looking for information online, but it's not a problem at that point. We had the tooling to be able to try and solve.
I still find it so fascinating that accuracy is not the number one thing. So then it kind of begs this kind of overall question then, what is the outcomes that we should be measuring then ultimately? Like, what is success? Is it now more so like the behavior intent, what people do afterwards? Does it rely more on how information is presented? And then also talk to me more about how you feel that information should be presented, like what we should be doing.
I guess in a perfect world, the ideal thing to measure would be, I think, as you said, outcomes. And I think outcomes, if you take it to the extreme, would be really outcomes on whether kind of like the concern that people had actually resolved properly. And so that's sort of like, I think, the final outcome. It's hard to measure that because you need to wait for outcomes to happen or not. And so there's quite a bit of a longitudinal follow-up problem in that kind of study design. If we take a step back from that more idealized setting, I think what would be nice is if there's more of a prospective study where people with real concerns, in this particular study, there were real concerns. And after that, we're able to see if these match up really well. Now, we have done something somewhat similar to that. This was more of a feasibility study, about 100 people. We did get much deeper, richer qualitative feedback from these participants. And so this was 100 participants. They spoke 3 to 4 different primary languages. There was a little bit of a translation layer on top of this, which was interesting as well. But then we found that their rates of guessing qualitatively was actually quite similar in terms of the trends to what we saw in this study. We did find additional layers of complexity that we weren't expecting. So in that particular study, what we had in a setup was that every participant went through the flow. They used the AI tool. They had surveys before and after. And then as part of the standard protocol, they saw a clinician right after, during the same session. So the thing that we couldn't really measure and control for there is that within the span of that kind of like in-person interaction, there was no time for that participant to sit with the app and, really scrolling through in depth, doing additional research and other things. So they didn't have that time to let that knowledge settle, as you would expect if it was a more real-world situation where someone experiences a condition. They schedule an appointment, and the appointment is inevitably some time away. In between the time that they go for the appointment versus when they experience the condition initially, there's some time for them to go look for information, and time does play a large factor in how they digest the information. And so in that other study, we didn't have a chance to do that, but we did find that qualitatively there were some similarities. One interesting note that we found was that if we compare kind of like next steps versus naming a condition. In the other study, we found, this is anecdotal and we didn't manage to dig in deep here just due to the sample size here, but we did find that people were self-reporting kind of like from the layperson perspective, that they were not as comfortable trying to figure out what something was. And the self-reported reason for that was that they felt like that was the job of the kind of like the clinician whom they were going to. They were trusting with their expertise. What they did try to understand is, what could this be? What is the universe of things that this could be? And it helps them kind of like set expectations and get a little bit of a sense of to what extent is this like extremely urgent versus not. In a perfect world, we'll have conversational and complex reasoning ability on the AI side where it could present this information and really walk through what the information actually contains. What does it mean? In a perfect world, these models will be perfect as well. But I think end of the day, these are models that we are developing. We do validate them very carefully, but we do need to be thoughtful that models in principle can make mistakes.
Talk about that ethical component then with AI and it potentially explaining and guiding. And, a lot of the times too, we see, unfortunately, that maybe you do go and see a doctor, but access is so hard. I mean, I barely can get in to go see one. And so AI might be that resource. And how do you feel about that? And even in your study, did people feel more confident when using AI, even if it was not necessarily accurate? How do you feel about people using AI for everything?
Maybe I'll answer the simpler part of it as it relates to this particular study's confidence. And I think we did see that there was quite a bit of a leap in confidence at their ability to kind of like name the condition. The self-reported confidence also increased, which was good. In terms of your question, taking a step back and thinking about people using AI, I think a lot of it is about access. And if someone does not have access to care, they do have access to the internet and other things. I think all along, even now, people would, go on the internet, look for information. The people they ask may not themselves be experts. And they are trying to figure out what it is that's wrong, how urgent it is that they get checked out. They're balancing that against a potentially very complex backdrop of their own life, where they may not be able to miss work, they may be very busy, they may have many kids, more than one job, and a variety of other factors, right? So it's a really complex overall decision. What I hope AI really helps do is that it helps people get access to better information than they would if they were just doing it in a more traditional way. So imagining that in a traditional way, they might say, black spot on arm, what do I do, right? And you get these websites that all just end up saying you have cancer because that matches up to black spot, but they don't have the training or the language to describe the, let's say if it's a melanoma suspect, the ABCDE criteria, other things. They're not able to do that necessarily. So I think with AI, I think we're starting to create these tools that have pretty broad and in some cases very deep capabilities that can sort of like really support people in navigating the wealth of information that are available online, but in ways that are much more sophisticated and hopefully much more accurate than they were previously.
What is the danger of it actually being Wizard of Oz, but where in the Wizard of Oz, you went and you asked it to solve your problems and it could give you anything and you would believe it to be true. That was ultimately it. And we can go into the aspects of Wizard of Oz and how it was your own confidence and slightly so forth. But there is that potential, right? Where you just end up kind of believing whatever it says. So how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think you're outlining a risk in the sense of over-reliance essentially on AI, where you believe it to be more capable than it actually is, and you don't have a good mechanism or we don't have good technologies that enable that confidence level to be communicated correctly or for that to be interpreted. There's kind of like very nuanced facets to interpreting confidence that arises in things like weather forecasting, for example. In terms of over-reliance versus under-reliance, I think so far we're seeing that there's a little bit more of a facet of under-reliance than over-reliance right now, especially on the consumer side. And this comes from not just our study in this case, but also other studies. So in our particular example, I think the rates of guessing that we were seeing was like fairly modest in terms of people being comfortable guessing at what the condition could be. Now, part of the contributor to that is because this was a research study. This was not kind of like their condition. And we didn't have a good way to capture like why they were not comfortable guessing. So some people might be just doing kind of like the study a little bit more quickly. And so that's why the guesses were empty. And so that's one element that we observed in terms of under-reliance in this particular kind of like study. The other aspect of under-reliance is also that if we look at a Wizard of Oz arm, it should have been perfect. And if people kind of like over-relied on it, you would have expected essentially a perfect outcome because they could just copy paste what it is. But for good or bad, that's not what they were doing. It does indicate they were taking these kind of like research seriously. And so they were actually trying to pattern match and figure out what it is. But it does indicate that they were not, at least to the most extreme extent, over relying on it. There were other studies too where they did this with more generative AI-based tools and not specific to dermatology, where they evaluated language models and found pretty good accuracy just for the model itself, but then presenting the information to non-experts and asking them for what it was or what I should do about it, the accuracy didn't end up being any better for the AI arm versus a control arm. So I think there are situations here where we do observe, if anything, more of under-reliance than over-reliance. But end of the day, I think it's a very tricky balance to strike, under-reliance, over-reliance. And this applies, I think, both to lay people as well as to experts as well. One thing that we should all be aware of is that technology over time does improve, which is a really good thing. But it also means that our mental models of these tools also have to evolve with time. Maybe at one point, you were very wary of over-relying on something. But as the technology improves, one should update that kind of like prior a little bit and figure out if that degree of over versus under reliance is still correct for the stage of maturity of that new technology.
Mm. Well, thank you so much. That was really fascinating, and I always love talking to you.
Thank you very much, Yulin. My pleasure, and great chatting as well.
I am Dr. Yulin Hswen, and I've been speaking with Dr. Yun Liu. You can find a link to the editorial in this episode's description. This episode was produced by Shelley Steffens at the JAMA Network. You can find a link to this paper and description below. To follow this and other JAMA Network podcasts, please visit us online at jamanetworkaudio.com or search for JAMA Network wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.
This content is protected by copyright by the American Medical Association with all rights reserved, including those for text and data mining, AI training, and similar technologies.